My dear reader, future accomplice, I invite you to draw closer, but with a certain wariness. Set aside for a moment the image they have sold you, the sanctified effigy that adorns the textbooks of art history. Forget the shaman in the felt fedora, the healer of a wounded Germany, the green activist who planted oak trees as if sowing seeds of hope. Forget the guru of social sculpture, the prophet who, with a messianic whisper, declared that every man is an artist. These are the masks, the costumes of felt and the pelts of coyotes that Joseph Beuys wore for the grand stage of the 20th century. They are carefully constructed personas, monuments of an iron will erected upon foundations that the artist himself took great pains to bury under tons of myth, silence and fat. And it is to this archaeological dig of the soul that I now invite you. This is not an act of iconoclastic vandalism, for demolition is a sterile and childish gesture. It is an act of intellectual courage, of daring to look at the man behind the legend and to find there not a saint or a demon, but a human being forged in the most brutal and incandescent contradictions of his time. What I propose is a dive into the dark face of Joseph Beuys, a journey into that which he would detest for you to know. This is not an exercise in shallow revisionism or a posthumous trial to assuage modern consciences. It is an attempt to understand the architecture of a genius, inseparable from its own pathologies. To understand how a man, in order to heal his nation, first had to invent his own cure, creating a legendary biography that would function as a plaster cast over wounds that perhaps never truly heal. Our starting point, our gateway into this labyrinth, must be the most sacred and untouchable of Beuys'ian myths, his origin story, the legend that grounds and irrigates his entire vast and complex artistic cosmology, the crash in the Crimea. The story, repeated ad nauseum by him and his acolytes with the solemnity of a gospel, is of a cinematic beauty and a terrifying convenience. We are in 1944, in the frozen heart of the Second World War. The young Joseph Beuys, a radio operator and gunner aboard a Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber, the dreaded Stuka of the Luftwaffe, is shot down in a blizzard over the steppes of the Crimea. Unconscious, his body shattered, and on the verge of freezing to death, he is rescued by a tribe of nomadic Tatars. These figures, described by Beuys as primitive and wise beings in deep communion with nature, know the arcane secrets of survival. They collect his broken body, wrap him in animal fat to rewarm and insulate him, and swaddle him in felt, that ancestral, protective, breathing material. This rescue is not merely physical, it is a baptism by fire and ice. It is the rebirth of Joseph Beuys, no longer as one of Hitler's soldiers, but as a man who has touched death and been saved by primal shamanic forces. The fat and the felt, from that moment on, cease to be simple materials and become the sacraments of his work, the conductors of thermal and spiritual energy, the symbols of healing, insulation, and transformation. It is a perfect narrative, a powerful origin myth. So perfect, in fact, that it becomes profoundly suspicious. The truth, dear reader, is infinitely more banal, more bureaucratic, and for that very reason, more revealing. The Swiss biographer Hans-Peter Riegel, in a work of relentless and courageous meticulousness, dismantled this fiction piece by piece with the coldness of a medical examiner. The Luftwaffe's records, the war diaries of Beuys's unit, are crystal clear. Yes, Beuys's plane, a Ju-87, crashed on March 16, 1944 in the Crimea. However, it was not in the midst of a snowstorm on a desolate and inaccessible steppe. The plane went down very close to the German military base in a village called Freifeld, and Beuys was promptly rescued by a German search commando, not by Tatars with their magical unguents. He was taken to a military field hospital where his multiple fractures and concussions were treated with the conventional medicine of the time, not with fat and felt. The final blow to the legend comes from history itself. In May 1944, just weeks after Beuys's accident, the entire Tatar population of the Crimea was brutally deported en masse to Central Asia on Stalin's orders, under the accusation of collaboration with the Nazis. To find a tribe of nomadic Tatars wandering freely there at that exact moment and willing to save an enemy aviator would be a statistical miracle, a historical impossibility. The legend, therefore, is not a poetic exaggeration. It is an invention, a deliberate, calculated lie sustained over 4 decades. And here lies the first and most crucial door to Beuys's dark labyrinth. Why create such an elaborate and fundamental lie? The answer cannot be found in vanity or artistic eccentricity. It is a sophisticated strategy of psychic survival and of building a new identity, not just for himself, but for a Germany in ruins. By inventing the Tatars as his saviors, Beuys performs a biographical transubstantiation. He symbolically detaches himself from his Nazi past, a past that was far more active than he would have liked to admit. He exchanges the ideological paternity of Hitler for the adoption of a primitive, pure, Oriental people outside of the corrupt Western history that led to Auschwitz. He is no longer the Luftwaffe gunner, a voluntary accomplice in the war machine of the Third Reich. He is the reborn, the initiated, the one who was touched by the wisdom of the earth and the warmth of fat. The story of the Crimea is a genuine operation of biographical laundering on an epic scale. Beuys needed to erase the soldier to create the shaman. And post-war Germany, desperate for figures who offered a path beyond paralyzing guilt and collective shame, eagerly bought into this mythology. Beuys offered Germany a way to reconnect with a mythical, tribal, Germanic past that was not the Nazi past, but something earlier, deeper, supposedly more authentic. He became the healer that the sick nation desired. But the healer, as we now know, forged his diploma in a fiction. The first raw material of Joseph Beuys was not felt or fat. It was the lie. This need to rewrite the past inevitably leads us to the densest and most uncomfortable shadow that hangs over Beuys: his relationship with National Socialism. The official discourse curated by the artist himself and perpetuated by his admirers is that he, like so many young people of his generation, was merely a product of his time, a member of the Hitler Youth, because it was almost compulsory, a soldier who simply did his duty to his country. A narrative of passivity, of being dragged along by the gears of history. But the investigations of Riegel and other historians paint a much more disturbing and active picture. Beuys was not a reluctant recruit. He volunteered for the Luftwaffe in 1941, driven by a patriotic idealism, and it seems a genuine affinity for the ideals of the regime. In his early years, he flirted with the idea of becoming a doctor or a natural scientist, and his interests aligned with the Nazi emphasis on biology, land, and racial purity. Moreover, there is compelling evidence that he actively participated in a book burning on July 9, 1933, in the courtyard of his school in Kleve, an event he would later try to reinterpret as an act of salvation, claiming to have rescued a book from the flames. The image of the artist who, decades later, would champion freedom of expression and the transformative power of knowledge clashes violently with that of the young man in uniform helping to cast the works of degenerate, Jewish and democratic authors into the fire. The crucial point, however, is not just what Beuys did during the war, but how he dealt, or rather failed to deal, with that past afterward. Unlike many intellectuals and artists of his generation, such as the writers of Group 47, who engaged in a painful and necessary process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the work of coming to terms with the past, Beuys opted for the strategy of mythical substitution that we have already discussed. But there is more. Riegel argues forcefully that Beuys never truly distanced himself from certain ideological pillars of Nazism. He merely translated them into a new esoteric and artistic language. His loyalty to old war comrades is a documented fact. He maintained contact and deep relationships with former Nazi officers and prominent figures of the old regime throughout his life. Karl Fasterbend, for example, a close friend and a key figure in organizing his most important political and artistic initiatives, such as the Office for Direct Democracy, was a former member of the SS, the ideological and murderous elite of Hitler's regime. Another figure in his inner circle was Willy Bongard, a former Luftwaffe officer who became an influential art market journalist and helped promote Beuys's career. This loyalty to men with such a dark past, disguised as wartime camaraderie, suggests a refusal to make a decisive break with the structures and mentalities that led Germany to catastrophe. The most profound and devastating critique, however, goes beyond personal connections and delves into the very structure of his artistic and political thought. Riegel and other critics, such as the art historian Benjamin Buchloh, suggest that Beuys's social sculpture, his grand and revolutionary theory that the whole of society could be shaped like a work of art, dangerously echoes the Nazi concept of Gemeinschaft, people's community, and the idea of a Volkskörper, body of the people, to be purified, healed, and shaped by a superior and visionary will. Beuys's rhetoric about healing, purity, energy, social warmth, and the need for a charismatic and intuitive leader, himself the shaman, to guide society toward a new era, sounds to some attentive ears like a transposition of fascist aesthetics and biopolitics into the field of the artistic avant-garde. His famous and seemingly liberating phrase, "Every man is an artist," can be read not only as a utopian call to universal creativity, but also in a more cynical and realistic light as an updated version of the Führerprinzip, the leader principle. Yes, everyone is an artist, but it is he, Beuys, the great artist, who defines what art is, who sets the parameters, who channels the collective energy. Everyone is invited to participate in the social sculpture, but the final form of the sculpture has already been decided by the master. This is not to state, simplistically, that Beuys was a clandestine Nazi. That would be a caricature. It is to suggest something perhaps more disturbing, that the matrix of his thought, the way he conceived the relationship between individual, community, nation, and leadership, was permanently marked and shaped by the ideology in which he was immersed in his most formative years. He would not have overcome Nazism. Instead, he would have sublimated and recycled it into a complex, fascinating, and profoundly ambiguous artistic cosmology. It is impossible to separate this ideological ambiguity from his deep and lifelong immersion in Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy. To the general public, anthroposophy may sound like a harmless and even progressive philosophy, a mixture of Eastern spirituality, Christian mysticism, pedagogy, the famous Waldorf schools, and biodynamic agriculture. Beuys found in Steiner's labyrinthine writings a universe that provided him with the conceptual tools to build his entire post-war oeuvre, the idea of a spiritual world accessible through disciplined thought, the belief in reincarnation and karma, the importance of ethereal and astral forces, the vision of the universe as a living organism. All of this became central to Beuys's language. He saw art not as aesthetics, but as an anthroposophical practice, a means of healing the modern fracture between the material and the spiritual, between science and religion. However, anthroposophy, like its main artistic disciple, also has its dark side, a side that Beuys and his defenders rarely discussed in public. Steiner's theories, formulated in the early 20th century, are replete with deeply problematic racial concepts, including a hierarchy of root races, Aryan, Atlantean, Lemurian, and ideas about the spiritual evolution of different peoples that are, to say the least, incompatible with an egalitarian view of humanity. For Steiner, certain races were seen as decadent or retarded in their spiritual development, while the white or Central European race was seen as the vanguard of human evolution. The question that arises, and that many prefer to avoid, is, to what extent did Beuys absorb and perpetuate these more controversial aspects of Steinerian doctrine? Although he publicly positioned himself as a defender of democracy, internationalism, and even co-founded a branch of the Green Party, his work is filled with an imagery that values the Nordic, the Germanic, the Eurasian, and a certain mythology of blood and soil, Blut und Boden, that finds uncomfortable parallels in both anthroposophy and the Völkisch folk nationalist ideology that preceded and fueled Nazism. By embracing anthroposophy so completely, Beuys found a belief system that allowed him to maintain an essentially romantic, idealistic, and Germanocentric worldview, but under the guise of a universalist and avant-garde spirituality. It was once again a brilliant maneuver of translation and camouflage. This figure of a spiritual leader, of an enlightened guru, also manifested itself very concretely in his personal and professional behavior. The public image was that of a revolutionary professor, an anti-authoritarian who, in a gesture of radical generosity, opened his classes at the prestigious Düsseldorf Art Academy to anyone who wanted to enter, challenging the institution's admission rules until he was dramatically fired in 1972. This act turned him into a martyr for academic freedom, a hero to the students. However, accounts from former students and collaborators, often suppressed by the official hagiography, paint a different, less flattering portrait. Beuys could be charismatic and inspiring, no doubt, but he was also described as domineering, dogmatic, and profoundly authoritarian. He did not so much foster debate as deliver sermons. His famous public discussions, which could last for hours, were in fact long monologues in which he expounded his theories on art, economics, and spirituality, rarely accepting questions that challenged the foundations of his hermetic system. He built around himself a circle of loyal followers, almost disciples, who perpetuated his message and protected him from external criticism. There was the public persona, the visionary, the leftist, the ecologist, the libertarian. But in private, Beuys was described as conservative in his personal tastes, averse to the rock and pop culture of his time, and extremely impatient with those who did not bow to his intellectual and spiritual authority. He was not a liberator of consciences, but a patriarch who demanded absolute loyalty. The Free International University for Creativity and Interdisciplinary Research that he founded after his dismissal sounded like the most democratic of projects. In practice, it was a platform for the dissemination of a single and sovereign worldview, his own. And like any good guru, like any leader of a movement that mixes politics and spirituality, Beuys also had a complex, ambiguous, and ultimately hypocritical relationship with power and money. He presented himself as a radical critic of capitalism, both of the Western Bloc and of the state communism of the Soviet bloc. He proposed a third way, an economy based on creativity and cooperation. His works, made of perishable and abject materials like fat and felt, or his performance actions, which existed only at the moment of their execution, seemed to challenge the logic of the art market and the luxury commodity. The fat corner, fetica, a mass of animal fat that he installed in the corner of his studio and later in galleries, was the anti-monument, the sculpture that decomposes, that stinks, that cannot be easily bought and sold like a bronze or a painting. However, this anti-capitalist stance was, for the most part, a performative facade. Beuys was a master at using the system he so fervently criticized. He understood, perhaps better than any artist of his generation, the power of the personal brand. The felt hat, the fishing vest, his uniform was an instantly recognizable logo, a brilliant branding tool. He was one of the pioneers in the mass production of multiples, editions of signed objects at more accessible prices that, according to his discourse, democratized the ownership of art. In reality, the multiples became a highly lucrative business, turning his most radical ideas into collectible commodities and making him a very wealthy and successful artist. The contradiction reached its peak, becoming almost a parody, when Beuys, the radical ecologist, the prophet of simplicity, the critic of consumerism, starred in a television commercial for a Japanese whiskey. The official justification, as always, was noble. The money raised would help finance his public interest art projects, such as the monumental planting of 7,000 oaks in Kassel. But the image of the anti-materialist shaman, looking seriously at the camera and selling an alcoholic beverage for a large corporation, is a powerful and devastating metaphor for his own glaring incongruities. He wanted the revolution, but he also wanted the benefits and comfort of the system he promised to overthrow. By putting all these pieces together, the invented biography, the persistent and unresolved shadow of Nazism, the racialized esotericism of anthroposophy, the messianic authoritarianism of his circle, and his astute navigation of the capitalist market, the figure of Joseph Beuys becomes infinitely more tragic, more complex, and paradoxically more human. He is not the immaculate saint of conceptual art that many would like him to be. He is a man profoundly wounded by history, by his personal history, and by the history of his country. A man who possessed a seismic sensitivity to the diseases of his time, materialism, alienation, the ecological crisis, historical amnesia, but who tried to cure them with remedies that at times contained the same poisons that caused the illness. His entire life can be seen as a gigantic and desperate performance to escape himself, to flee the young idealist who volunteered for the Luftwaffe, the accomplice of a genocidal regime. Art, for him, was not just a profession or a vocation, it was an existential alibi. It was a psychoanalytic defense mechanism on a monumental scale, a way of sublimating insurmountable traumas and guilt into a new religion of which he was the sole priest. Why then should we care about this dark side? What do we gain by unearthing these inconvenient and painful truths? We gain freedom. The freedom not to be held hostage by the myths that great men construct for themselves and for posterity. We gain a deeper and more honest understanding not only of Beuys, but of the very nature of art and memory in the post-catastrophe world. Beuys's work does not become smaller or irrelevant because of his personal flaws. On the contrary, it becomes a richer, more urgent, and more complex historical and psychological document. His sculptures of felt and fat are no longer just symbols of a shamanic rescue that never happened, but monuments to his own fiction, memorials to a real wound that he tried to cover with a fantastic story. His drawings and blackboard diagrams are not just lessons in an esoteric philosophy, but feverish maps of a labyrinthine mind, trying, desperately, to reconcile the irreconcilable. German romantic idealism and Nazi barbarism, the will to heal and the inability to confess. Looking at the dark face of Beuys is ultimately a motivational act, for it teaches us that even the greatest cultural heroes are profoundly, tragically flawed. And it is in their flaws, in their contradictions, in their lies, that we find their humanity, and perhaps the true source of their art. The anguish, the unconfessed guilt, the overwhelming need to redeem himself in the eyes of the world, and perhaps of himself. These were the chaotic energies, the psychic fats that fueled his vast and tireless production. He was a liar, yes, a great liar. But perhaps like all great artists, he lied to tell us a deeper and more uncomfortable truth about pain, memory, and the impossible human need for redemption. He would detest for you to know all this, because this truth dismantles the image of the infallible prophet that he worked so hard to project and control. But in knowing we do not lose him, we truly find him for the first time. Not as the shaman who descended from the heavens in a mythical story, but as the man who crawled out of the smoking rubble of the 20th century, covered in scars, lies, and a desperate, contradictory, and yet undeniable genius. And that story, dear reader, that uncomfortable truth is infinitely more impactful and relevant than any legend.